The federal government has been supporting the country's housing needs for almost a century, whether by help for people of low income or through tax deductions for mortgages. In some neighborhoods, government programs can help offset the pressures of a hot real estate market. That certainly goes for Boston's Chinatown. To tell us about the effect of budget cuts in this part of the city is the executive director of the Asian Community Development Corporation, Angie Liou. Thank you very much for being with us, Angie.
Thank you, Chris.
First of all, tell me a little of the history of Chinatown. This is a neighborhood that was shrunk by things like the Mass Turnpike and some other development, and now you've got all this hot real estate market. So talk about how this has really dramatically, I guess, increased the need for help with housing.
I think with the proximity of Chinatown to downtown and the financial district, with this new wave of people moving back into the city, wanting to live downtown, have all the amenities, Chinatown has become a very popular place for people to move into. So it's no longer just a traditional working class immigrant families who live there. There are now a lot of new luxury buildings, mostly rentals that cater to the young, affluent, maybe it's graduate students or young professionals who don't have kids yet, who want to live close to all the exciting downtown amenities. And that's putting a lot of pressure in terms of property values rising, filtering down to rising rents, a lot of times resulting in eviction of the long-time residents in Chinatown.
Well, I know this is an important neighborhood for those working class families you meant to live in and work in, but as far as being able to afford housing that they can still live in Chinatown, how has the federal government been helpful with that so far?
Historically, the federal government has provided subsidies or loans to help build affordable housing through a variety of ways. 40, 50 years ago, HUD and FHA had a lot of just mortgage programs. And when things weren't so expensive to develop, you could basically, a nonprofit or a church would take out a loan from HUD and build a multifamily apartment building, and that was it. And there were also other subsidy programs like CDBG, the Community Development Block Grants, and the Federal Home Program that provides subsidies for housing as well as other related human and social services. Then about 30 years ago, the federal government rolled out this tax credit program. It's called the Low Income Housing Tax Credits. So that was a really innovative and unique program. And it remains one of the most important tools we have today for developing affordable housing. And traditionally, it has very strong bipartisan support because this is not a typical subsidy or handout, if you will, from the government. Instead, it's tax credits that leverages private investments from the private sector.
This is BNN News. We're talking with Angie Liou from the Asian Community Development Corporation. Well, right now you're using those credits for one development in Chinatown that at least includes some affordable housing. And this is not because of a budget cut that you have to worry, but because of a possible change in tax policy.
Correct. So Oak Terrace Apartments is actually the very first development that ACDC undertook. So we completed the Oak Terrace Apartments back in 1995, so it's been a little over 20 years. It was originally financed with the tax credit program, but 22 years have gone by and the building needs some work, updates to some of the units as well as major building systems. And it was also time to refinance and recapitalize. So as part of that refinancing, we also relied on the tax credit program. So basically, our refinancing and rehabilitation project was ready to go to closing with our tax credit investor as well as our lender at the end of December We had a contractor on board who was ready to start as soon as we gave them the go-ahead. The drawings were all finalized, but closing at the end of December, 2 months after the election, then I don't think anyone saw the election turning out the way it did. So I think between November and December, people start to really think about what the incoming administration's policy is going to have an effect on the tax credit program. And namely, that has to do with the often talked about tax reform that the Trump administration has said that it's going to implement. So that means lowering the tax rate from 35% for corporations down to anywhere from 25, 20, or even 15%. So this has a profound impact on the tax credits. So going back to the way the tax credit works, if you think about it, the investors buy the tax credits because they're using them to offset their tax liabilities for 10 years. So if the tax rate gets lowered, let's say an investor originally owes $1 million in taxes. Now they only need to pay $750,000 in taxes. They don't need as much tax credits as before the reform, right? So then that has a direct impact on the demand as well as the pricing of the tax credits. It affects how much investment we can get from them.
Well, there are other CDCs around Boston, and some of them also contending with gentrification in the neighborhood. If they're in the race to build affordable housing and they get this tax credit that's less financially attractive, what's the big picture here?
I think the big picture, there are several stages. So I think for the projects that have already been in the works, and are in the middle of putting together all their funding sources, they are probably the most vulnerable because they were going in, probably a year or two ago with a certain set of assumptions about how much money they could raise from the tax credit program, which informs what type of project they're going to do. So now they have to scramble because they have to be more conservative about how much they could raise from a tax credit. But I think big picture going forward is that for new projects that are starting to be planned right now, I think all the CDCs are probably going to take a more conservative approach and assume that we're not going to be able to raise as much from these tax credits. And there's that gap, right, that needs to be made up somewhere else. And that could very well mean having to go to the city and state for more subsidies.
And of course, one other program that might be cut, maybe not so much an issue in Chinatown, is the Choice Neighborhood Program. And that has been used to basically rebuild some of the aging public housing in Boston. So that's a lot of units we're potentially talking about. It
is a lot. I don't know as much about those programs, so I can't really speak to them. But from what I can see, those funding have been really successful in transforming entire neighborhoods.
All right. Thank you very much for being with us.
Great.
Angie Liou from the Asian Community Development Corporation.